Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today we want to talk about chaos theory. So let's get started. So most of us understand chaos as being a state of disorganization. Namely, in science, it's called entropy. Now, those who want us to believe in chaos want us to believe that everything came out of chaos. Now, in order to be able to understand this topic a little better, we need to understand where it is that this idea of chaos came from. It actually came from a scientific experiment that is the basis of something called Brownian motion. And Brownian motion is the random movement, or what was observed to be as the random movement of atoms or particles. In an experiment in which they had a beaker that had a liquid in it and it had two electrodes, they ran an electric current and they found that the atoms within the liquid moved in one direction, from one electrode to the other. When the electric current was stopped, they found that the particles were moving in what seemed to be a random motion, and this is what they called chaos or entropy. And the theory was established that based on Brownian motion, that every system moves to chaos unless it is organized. Now, there are scientists that want us to believe that this applies to the entire universe, that this universe was in a state of chaos, and then they make a claim, which is quite a jump, that this chaos ended up creating organization all by itself and by coincidence. So the sun, the solar system, RNA, DNA, all of that came out of chaos and coincidence without it having an organizer. Now, we were able to prove previously that in order for something to be organized, it needs an organizer. We simply and empirically looked at examples that prove this. We said, well, who organizes your room? You said, I do. I said, who organizes a doctor's office? You said, probably a janitor or a nurse. We said, who organizes your home? You said, my mother does. We said, who organizes, for example, a school curriculum? We said, the school board does. And we came to the conclusion that in order for something to be organized, it requires a creator of that organization. And that's a simple, rational, logical necessity. So, where then did we get this concept that everything came from chaos? Because if we look at what scientists tell us, not just what we come to a logical conclusion to understand, but scientists actually don't contend that everything came out of chaos. A select number of scientists who are atheistic have this contention. Many have used the idea of chaos theory to try to serve their purpose. However, the term chaos theory was actually coined by a scientist from Harvard University who was focused on understanding weather and weather patterns. And his name was Dr. Edward Lorenz. And Dr. Edward Lorenz in the 1960s studied weather and weather patterns. And what he started off thinking was chaotic movement. He believed in theory that it's got to be that these weather movements and climatic changes are based on some sort of pattern. So he started to collect data, meteorological data specifically. And what he found was that there were actual patterns of climatic and atmospheric behaviors. So he came to the conclusion, which he called chaos theory, that all of the weather patterns are really based on patterns of behavior of the climate and of the atmosphere that are actually predictable and that are known. But there are so many of them that at first glance, they're hard to understand. And so the untrained eye, the unscientific eye, would come to an understanding, albeit unempirical, that it may look disorganized and chaotic. However, it really is organized. It's in a supreme form of organization. Now, he wasn't the only scientist, but he is the scientist that coined the term chaos theory. And chaos theory doesn't mean disorganization and that everything goes to chaos. In actual fact, Edward Lorenz, based on what he proved, he contends, based on his studies, that everything actually comes from a supreme form of organization and a patterned behavior of the atmosphere and of the climate. Also, Benoit Mandelbrot, he actually has 15 PhDs. He passed away recently, and he held the chair of Albert Einstein. Very well-known scientist, a Swiss scientist, a mathematician who studied the borders of nations or of land masses. And his goal was to determine a way of measuring land masses accurately. Because, they have a very organic form, so they're very hard to measure. So he sought to develop an algorithm that would help us measure land masses. And that's what he did. He discovered that what seems to be disorganized to us, what seems to be organic to the point that it's hard to understand how to measure it, actually succumbs to an algorithm. And that specific algorithm is based on something called fractal mathematics. That everything basically boils down to a single element called a fractal, an instance that is repeated over and over that creates that look of the organic form that we know. And of course, this makes sense because we know that water, as it strikes land masses, in itself is made out of H2O. And that dynamic fluid form of H2O is organized in itself. And therefore, when it hits something else that is organized, such as soil, it will only remove an organized and a known amount of that soil. And that soil will move and erode in turn in an organized fashion also. That's just common sense. He was able, Benoit Mandelbrot, to determine the algorithm by which this occurs. Now, this fractal mathematics has become so important to our everyday lives, even though most of us don't realize it. Our very cell phones, the antennas within them, are fractal antennas. An instance of an antenna form that is what receives the waves that are required in order for us to communicate. And before, antennas used to be huge, but now, taking that one instance, it was turned into the smallest form of that antenna and placed within our phones. Also, fractal mathematics is used by graphic artists and animators in order to create these beautiful CGI forms and animations that we know of, such as smoke and such as fire, all based on a small repeated instance of it that is multiplied over and over. It is also used in understanding biological systems. We find, for example, that same algorithm of fractal mathematics is used to understand how to measure a forest. Not just that, based on the algorithm, that forest and the trees within it succumb to the algorithm so much so that the distances between each tree and the distance between each branch are actually in a specific ratio. And that the distance between each leaf is equivalent and in ratio to the distance and proportionate to the distance between each branch and each tree in that forest. So then we were able to prove scientifically and rationally that there's no such thing as chaos or coincidence, which means that we were able to prove our original point, which we proved rationally, that this universe came not out of coincidence, but out of organization, and that it had to have a creator, because for something to be organized, it needs a creator of its organization. And so then, this whole idea of the world coming out of chaos and coincidence is false. Next, we'll take a look at evolution. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.